Welcome everyone. This is Patricia from the International Hospital Federation. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, When Doing the Right Thing Hurts Your Financials, Hospital Management in Between the Patient and Regulation. This webinar is being presented by Professor Helmut Kern, CEO of Hospital of the Brothers of St. John of God, Vienna. Helmut is the CEO of the Hospital of the Brothers of St. John of God, Vienna, Austria, and Deputy Chairman of the University Council of Vienna University. He serves as Non-Executive Director of Global Companies and teaches strategy and business policy at the Technical University, Vienna. Before joining the healthcare world, he was a global partner at Deloitte and head of consulting at PwC. Helmut is passionate about efficiency and deregulation. He lives in Vienna, Austria, and owns degrees in management and medieval history. He's 54 years old, happily married, and has adult twin daughters, and an Australian Shepherd completes the family. Helmut, thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Patricia, for the kind introduction. Good day, everyone. I understand we have participants of every time zone and climate zone, and so I send greetings from pretty rainy and cold Vienna. We have 15 degrees. We have no monsoon, but still lots of rain here in these days. It's really a pleasure and honor for me that you all participate in that webinar. And I hope in the next 30 minutes or so, when I will talk about 3 cases which give good examples why doing the right things for the patient can be the wrong thing from a financial or management perspective, that you can take some things away from that. As we all know, healthcare is one of the most regulated markets, if not the most regulated market in most countries. Now, one might say health should not be called a market at all, or should not be seen from an economic perspective, as people's health and welfare is not to be measured in financials. Even stranger, you might think, when someone from a non-profit Catholic hospital talks about financials. But the reality is that we all have to live with scarce resources and scarce financial resources. Being responsible for health institutions, our obligation is to allocate those financial resources in an efficient and effective manner to services for patients that maximize patient value on an individual basis, but also for the health system overall. Now, medical and financial regulation on the public healthcare system intends to secure the best possible treatment for patients. Policymakers and central planners of the healthcare systems are in a very difficult situation, though. They have to create and maintain a functioning healthcare system, while on the other hand, they are being pushed by multiple interest groups. Patients on one side, patients which equals taxpayers, who want to have the best possible service when they need it, and they want it immediately and close to their homes. Nurses, who in many countries are very scarce resources, who push for higher income and better working conditions. Doctors, also very scarce resources in many countries, who also push for higher income and better working conditions. Pharma groups and producers of medical equipment who want a higher stake in the healthcare market, of the healthcare cake. And finally, politicians who promise best care for less money to their voters and let others, the healthcare providers, struggle with how to put that in place. So a very difficult situation, and that leads to the situation that healthcare is not only one of the highest regulated industries, but also one with the most misregulation or wrong regulation. What do I mean by misregulation? Misregulation in the current is that current regulation directs financial resources in the wrong directions. It unintendedly encourages inefficient allocation of funds, leading to spend money where it's wasted and not having the money where it's needed. It unintendedly sets incentives for unethical decisions, optimizing the situations of or individuals which act contrary to what would be best for patients and the public. and economists amongst you may know that problem as moral hazard. These are all consequences of misregulation, and whenever you in your daily efforts do the best for your patients, I'm sure that every one of you encounters numerous cases of such situations of misregulation. While I will talk to you about 3 specific cases of Austria, which may not apply, or very likely will not apply to you and your respective countries, I'm pretty sure you will find similar cases and similar problems in regulation in your jurisdictions. What I would like to take you away from this webinar are 4 things. First, an open mind to detect misregulation and misincentives. Second, an open heart to do the right things for the patients, even when it hurts your financials. Third, an open mouth or an ink-filled pen to address misregulation with policymakers and fight for better regulation. And fourth, and finally, you should know that you're not alone and we are facing the same kind of problems around the globe. And you have a community here at the IHF where you can share and discuss your thoughts and concerns also outside your local community to get fresh input and thoughts. After that introduction, before we get into our 3 cases, I will give you a very brief introduction into the Austrian social security system just to put the cases into context, and then proceed to talk about 3 cases and the learnings out of these cases. And I'm looking forward to your comments and questions and the discussion afterwards. The first case is from urology, and I will talk about laparoscopic versus robotic prostatectomy and wrong DRG system incentives, which can put patients into intensive care, patients who wouldn't need intensive care. The second case will deal with a 24/7 stroke service in the city of Vienna, and will demonstrate the problems of silo thinking and health planning, wrong health planning, which indeed can kill people. And the third case is about oncologic therapy and a very, very strange incentive system, which, when being exploited by healthcare providers, would lead to less comfort for patients and higher costs for the system. So as Patricia said, please use the chat or the question and answer function, and she will collect the questions. Now, just briefly on the Austrian social security system to get the context. Austria has a governmental social system covering more than 99% of our population. It's DRG-like, and we have highest medical standards providing top medical services to the whole population of about 8 million Austrians, with reasonable waiting times for elective operations. As DRG does not cover all healthcare costs, the state subsidizes the system also out of country tax revenue, which means while being designed as a Bismarck system, in reality our system is a mix of a Bismarck and a Beveridge way of creating your healthcare system, your social system. While the system is medically on high standards, it is also one of the most expensive systems globally, most due to inefficient allocation of resources and with respect to too high hospitalization rates. We have more than 770 beds per 100,000 inhabitants, which is one of the highest numbers of beds per pop worldwide, more than double the number, for example, of Denmark, who is regarded to have one of the top quality health systems, and only better in the OECD countries than Korea, Japan, and Germany. We also have about 5 doctors per 1,000 inhabitants, which brings us to one of the countries with the highest doctor density worldwide. But we still have scarcity of doctors in our system for reasons of misallocation. They are just in the wrong places. And you could that regard as a fun fact, but actually it's not really funny. We have 266 hospital overnight stays per 1,000 inhabitants per year. So every 1 of 4 Austrians stays at least 1 night per year in a hospital. which means that we are about 70% above average of OECD countries here. So you could say Austrians love to stay in hospitals, which a little bit seems to be part of our culture. So just with that little background, let me get into the first case here, prostatectomy, robotic versus laparoscopic. We operate in our hospital 2 Da Vinci systems in our Vienna hospital, operating in 4 disciplines, which are urology, gynecology, ENT, and visceral surgery. I do not want to dig deeper into the question if laparoscopic and robotic surgery makes medical or economic sense. There are lots of literature around that, most with a database that would be statistically insignificant, actually. And when you read publications on robotic surgery, you quickly will identify the position of the Alpha Pro or CON robots, and just in the ways they present facts and data. Anyway, that's not our question today. The calculation based on my presentation is done solely with data of our hospital, out of our good but not perfect costing system, from about 1,500 robotic operations, and quite a number of laparoscopic operations. Now, when you look at the columns from left to right, we do not, it's from right to left actually, we do not do open surgery since many years. So that's why these data are in light gray, and they are the last available data on open surgery. In the middle column, you will see the laparoscopic surgery. And in the left-hand column, you see the Da Vinci data, so the robotic surgery data. And what you can find out, we do, today, we do most of our operations just with the Da Vinci. We stopped doing laparoscopic about 5 years ago, so the data, last available data of laparoscopic is about 5 years old, because we do them now only in special cases. When you look at that, you find out that the cost of surgery differs quite a bit, and differs in 2 cases, the cost of the surgery and the ward-related cost. The net margin is negative, and I want to emphasize the line without 1-day ICU, because, well, I'll come today back on that just a little bit later. To the ward-related cost, we see here, and that's a caveat, that we have an average length of stay in robotic surgery of 6.24 days versus 10.64 in laparoscopic. Now, this certainly changed over the last years, and if we would do laparoscopic today, we would be much lower than 10.64. I'm sure you have data out of your hospitals. That would be, the difference would be much less than the 4.4 days we have here. The interesting thing that we have a break even at the delta of about 2.1 days of stay in the hospital. So while robotic is much more expensive in the surgery, people are released of the hospital earlier than with laparoscopic. That's our data. Again, there's lots of literature which would doubt that, but our experience is that people go home earlier. We would have a break even with stays which are 2.1 days shorter than laparoscopic. In reality, we believe it's around 1 day we save with robotic surgery. So a realistic delta of 1 day length of stay leads to a $757 advantage for laparoscopic. And again, I refer to the ICU stay, which is actually the case we're talking about today. Here on the next slide, you have a little more detail in the calculation. Most people, when I talk about laparoscopic versus robotic, are interested in the calculation, which again is not the focus of the presentation today. But just to give you an idea, we have lower personal cost in the Da Vinci operations, just because our surgeons are quicker with the Da Vinci than they are laparoscopic. We have the same team, same people doing Da Vinci who did laparoscopic a couple of years ago, but that cost is overcompensated. That cost saving of the Da Vinci is overcompensated by the material cost and the depreciation of the Da Vinci, making the Da Vinci cost of surgery much more expensive. You'll find here 2,200 laparoscopic euros, that's all in euros, versus 3,644 cost of surgery in Da Vinci. But in the middle table, you can see that the difference in the length of stay now is in favor of the Da Vinci, leading to a ward cost consisting of the cost of the nurses, consist of doctors allocated to the wards doing the ward rounds, medication and cleaning, heating, and all you could imagine in the ward cost, leading to a ward cost per day of 690 euros in our case, in our hospital. And just because Da Vinci stays so much shorter, Da Vinci catches up and leads to a small net profit compared to laparoscopic. Again, the difference of laparoscopic, it would not be 10 days today, so laparoscopic would look much better today. But if you look at the total cost in the right table, here we come to the point. In the very right column, you see that without one day intensive care unit, we make a little loss on the radical prostatectomy. But if people stay one day in the ICU, if patients stay one night in the ICU, we instantly cover costs or even become profitable with that. Why is that the case? Here's the point, and here's the point for our case. Our DRG system is not outcome focused, it's completely activity focused. So we get more money if we put patients in the ICU, even if they wouldn't need it. Now, some, but not all prostatectomy patients need post-surgical intensive care, depending obviously on manufacturers. But the DRG system does not and cannot differentiate between those people who need it and those who don't. But instead of compensating the successful prostatectomy, the system just pays for activities performed on the patient. The more and the more intense you treat the patient, the more revenue you get, potentially leading to suboptimal decision making, taking into consideration factors that should just not be considered when making a medical decision. To put a patient in the ICU should definitely not be influenced by financial incentives, which our DRG system would give us here. So really a problem of moral hazard. Do you put a patient in ICU who doesn't need it, which would not be beneficial for the patient, just to cover your cost? That's it. Big problem. I'd like to jump to the second case here, where misregulation, misincentives have a big impact. Our 24/7 SRT service for stroke patients. For the non-doctors like me, what is it about? SRT stands for stent-retriever thrombectomy, and this is a highly effective treatment for ischemic stroke. SRT is performed by interventional radiologists, and the doctors insert a large type of IV catheter into the groin area, pass the catheter into the blood vessel in the brain, then a stent retriever device is navigated with a microcatheter and positioned through the blood clot, and then once deployed, the clot is now embedded with the device and trapped in the stent retriever. The clot can be safely removed from the body, which is a great technique. About 7 to 10% of all strokes are eligible for SRT treatment, and that treatment to be successful has to be performed within roughly 6 hours of the event. Now in Vienna, with about 2 million population, we are talking about 250 to 300 strokes eligible in Vienna with a population, Vienna has a population of about 2 million people. Now, what's the issue? SOT is a relatively young and pretty sophisticated technique, and many radiologists are normally focused on diagnostic radiology, and very few radiologists who want to work in a surgical environment. Now, this is why only a handful, some 10 to 15 interventional radiologists in Vienna who are familiar with SRT can perform those difficult and risky interventions. Those few radiologists are working in 3 hospitals, and their rosters were not coordinated. As a result, if someone had a stroke which was eligible for SRT, there was about a 50% chance that an SRT radiologist and their teams of SRT trained nurses were on duty in at least one of the 3 hospitals. Now, if that was the case, in addition, that patient had to be lucky enough that the ambulance or the helicopter brought him into that very hospital where those people were on duty and not in any other stroke unit in the city. In other words, with a 50% probability, about 125 to 150 patients died of a severely handicapped because Vienna was not implementing a 24/7 SRT service. Imagine 125 to 150 people. That means a small airliner crashing every year in the middle of the city without anyone publicly noticing. Now, here's the problem. SRT is quite an expensive but highly effective treatment. One SRT treatment costs about 10,000 euros per patient, and to maintain around-the-clock service in Vienna, some additional staff was needed, but the hospital's budget is kept. So health insurance would not pay for additional staff. Well, apart from the suffering of patients and their families, there is also an interesting financial aspect. Patients who do not get SRT treatment either die within a few hours or within a few days, or they are heavily handicapped for the rest of their lives. That costs society much more than the 10,000 euro SRT treatment. The point, though, is why did it happen that the annual disability pension for stroke patients who survive that kind of stroke is not paid by health insurance, it is paid by pension insurance. Pension insurance have to come up for disability pension, and they also have to pay, for example, for home care. The patient, if a younger one, has to account for lost future income. Families have to perform unpaid work for their handicapped relatives. So all that sums up to huge amounts compared to comparatively small 10,000 euros to avoid that would have been to be paid by health insurance. Now that was the situation. What happened? In 2017, 3 hospitals in cooperation with the city of Vienna introduced the 24/7 SRT service. We had to coordinate our rosters. Ambulance services had to know to which hospital to go on which weekday. And during the transport to the hospitals, pre-hospital diagnosis is performed on the way to the hospital. What happened is that since the introduction of the 24/7 service, in our hospital alone, we treated in the first year after introduction of the service, 38 patients more. That means in all Vienna, it was about 130 additional patients treated compared to the year before. This is a great outcome. I mean, 130 people being saved, and we could cover not yet 100%, but a very high percentage of SRT eligible strokes by now. So 130 lives could be saved or severe handicaps could be prevented. That's a great outcome. The additional cost, though, for the health insurance is only about 1.3 million euros a year. And the pension insurance saved at least 2.6 million euros annually for those patients, not to speak of follow-up costs in hospitals, no or low drug costs, subsequent drug costs for patients, and not to speak of the positive effects for patients and families. I mean, it's not only cheaper, it's great value, right? So this is, you would believe, a no-brainer. Why did it take so long to implement the 24/7 SRT service? And the sad truth is that all involved parties looked just at their own positions. No one felt responsible, no one took the initiative, and the dead patients were not visible as plane crash victims are visible. It took months, really months, to convince decision makers for what most of you would believe a no-brainer, and it all started with misregulation and misalignment of goals and incentives, not looking at the patient outcome. This leads us to the third case, the chemotherapies. That's an interesting one. Chemo patients, as you know, have a hard life. They come regularly to hospitals. Many of them have quite a limited lifespan. So it is more than understandable that they want to spend as much of their time with their families and not in hospitals. Before patients get their chemo, blood analysis is obligatory and not a big deal. It's just what we call a small lab. And from time to time, chemo patients also need a staging computer tomography to assess the status of their cancer. Our social security system allows 3 processes to treat those patients who need blood, computer tomography, and chemotherapy in one procedure. In the top of the slide, you can see the process which is financially most interesting for healthcare providers. You would send the patient to an external blood lab. With the result of the blood lab, he goes to the radiologist, outpatient radiologist, gets a staging CT. With the result of the staging CT, he comes to the hospital and then receives his or her chemotherapy. This process is the most costly for health insurance, the most profitable for providers, and the most inconvenient for patients. It's a 3-stop shop. You have 3 times waiting times for the patient, explaining why you are here and what you're doing, and so on and so on. But the blood lab gets paid, the outpatient radiologist gets paid, and the hospital gets paid. The second process in the middle of the slide is much more convenient for patients. Obviously, we could do all of these activities, we could perform all of these activities in our hospital. So we could make the blood lab, we could make the staging CT, and we could give the patient the chemotherapy. One waiting time, one-stop shop for the patient, single point of contact with doctors and nurses, different departments talk to each other and buy lines. But we as a hospital get the same amount of money for this process compared to the one I told you about before, where blood lab and CT are done outside of our house. So for us financially, this is not a good thing. For the patient, obviously, it's the most convenient and safest process. And in that process, the blood lab or the radiologists, they lose their revenue, which makes it also for health insurance the cheapest process. Now there's a third way of treating such a client, which is the same as in the one I described before, the second, but you keep the patient overnight. You give him an overnight stay in your hotel, you make him an inpatient, he stays overnight. What happens is that health insurance pays additional money for that night, even if no service is performed. It's just because patients stay a night in the hospital. So the hospital gets extra coverage for the overnight stay, making this process, again, more expensive for health insurance, but in very few cases with a medical indication. So again, here moral hazard is an option for hospitals. We do not do that, we try not to do that, but it's there and it could be done. So what are the learnings? of these three cases. The learnings are that payers and authorities need to understand the value chain. They just do not fully understand nor even control the value chain. The focus in general is still on activities performed, not on the outcome. The more you do, the more money you get as a health provider. It's not about the outcome. A good example, for example, our second case, the SRT stroke service, has broad implications for the patient journey and the patient value chain. Too many different stakeholders involved, follow too many different goals in an environment that is too fragmented in responsibility and accountability. Also, the service, and especially the point of service, must not determine the price. Like in our third example, it should not matter if the blood lab is taken inside a hospital or outside a hospital. If the CT is done in a hospital or outside a hospital, it should not, the payment should not vary depending on the point of service. Also, the point of service must not create conflicts of interest. The chemo example shows the danger of moral hazard. It's easy for the healthcare providers to maximize profits in a complex system which even can't be really controlled by authorities and payers. I'm convinced that these examples also lead to the conclusion that it's impossible to separate outcome and cost perspective. The cost, respectively the payment for the services, determines how players behave. It determines where players focus and where they direct their activities. Only if payment costs, or payment or the costs and the outcomes are aligned, the full benefits for the patient can be achieved. And finally, in hospitals, efficiency is sometimes seen, especially the clinical stuff, is sometimes seen as maximizing work for the staff and minimizing services for the patients. Actually, I believe it's exactly the opposite. Efficiency means lean, seamless, standardized, and most important, stable and errorless processes and activities and procedures. And these are all criteria that minimize process cost, but these are also the key criteria that maximize process quality and patient outcome. Therefore, efficiency is not the enemy, but really is the best friend of good service and outcome. Now, how do we get from learnings to action? So we have a little value framework here. Let me emphasize that the start here is valid on the micro as well as on the macro level. The value framework is applicable for healthcare providers as well as for social security systems, for decision makers as well as for healthcare staff. It's important to have the same understanding about outcome goals. That's the first thing. In OECD countries, we spend somewhere between 12 and 15% of GDP for healthcare, even more in the US. We better understand what we want to achieve with that enormous amount of money. And from a hospital view, we should better understand how to maximize patient outcome with the limited funds we have to operate our institutions. In order to do that, we have to understand the patient journey, because service providers, patients are customers, and as customers, patients have the right to get the attention and the service they need. And as taxpayers, they have the right to get the service as cheaply as possible. Patients do not care about the economics of each healthcare provider. They want the service providers to be paid to help them, not to be paid by the amount of resources they may waste on their treatment. This is why it's so important to measure costs and value contribution in each step of the process. There are few industries which collect such an amount of information like healthcare. So we maybe create information out of 10% of the huge amounts of data we collect. untapped treasures lie in our computers. Obviously, data protection requirements have to be respected and accounted for. But we also have the obligation to constantly evaluate the trade-off between data protection on one side and the improvement of outcome that can be achieved by sensible use of healthcare data we collect in all institutions. And last but not least, we have to change the culture. We have to change the culture, maybe especially in nonprofit organizations, where we have to align goals. We have to promote the idea that, and again, especially in nonprofit enterprises, that efficiency is not a tool for maximizing profits, but it's a tool for releasing resources for beneficial activities. And finally, of course, we have to close the loopholes for what I would call systems arbitrage for moral hazard, and as demonstrated in the first version of the chemo process in the third case I presented to you. Now, thanks for staying till the end. I hope you found some analogies to your countries, even if those cases may not apply, as I said at the beginning, in your jurisdiction, but from many conversations around the world, I understand that we all face the similar problems, and I'm looking forward to questions and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Helmut. We'll start reading some questions from the viewers shortly. Just to remind everyone that you can send your questions by typing them in the Q&A tab. All right, so here's your first question. How do you promote those ideas and the value framework within your hospital?
No, that's a good one. In our hospitals, we try to work on the culture very strongly. So the outcome thinking is not, in Europe, not very popular yet. There are initiatives driven out by the ICHM, for example, the Institute for Healthcare Outcome Measurement, activities that are being performed by Porter and Kaplan out of Harvard, or by Elizabeth Teisberg out of Austin, Texas. So we try to promote those ideas in our organization here by sending people to those courses, by having projects in our hospital, courses on process costing, courses on outcome measurement and management, and we encourage people in every steps of the process to question where there is a value add in their activities and where there is no value add in their activities. And we support all that by lean management activities in our hospitals. So lean management is a good tool, actually, we found out, to support that kind of thinking. And you have to get it through not only in administrative staff, but especially in clinical staff with nurses and doctors. So interdisciplinary cooperation is key to success here. People talking a lot to each other and trying to improve their own processes, always with the patient in mind and the patient outcome in mind first. And, which is more difficult actually, we try to promote that cross healthcare providers, which means that we try in our hospital to look at the patient journey even from before entering our hospital and monitor it after patients left our hospital.
Thank you, Helmut. Another question. In the case 2 that you showed earlier, what convinced the city of Vienna and the other stakeholders to implement the 24/7 SRT service?
Yeah, okay, I didn't mention that. I can go back to that slide. That was, yeah, here it was. So it took some time to implement it. It took time to convince the decision makers to convince it. How do we do that? Actually, there were two things that came along pretty nicely. We, the hospitals, tried to put pressure on the decision makers, and the only way politicians really got it was when we felt it would be time to talk to media about a service that could be provided and is not provided and kills people. And as you know, decision makers always have fear of media, and that a little speeded up the discussion. And a second thing, which was just luck actually, happened, like for our case, happened that a relative of an important politician had a stroke. And he, not an SRT stroke, but he, being confronted in his family with a stroke, he then was a big supporter for our case.
Thank you, Helmut. So regarding case number 3, which we presented earlier, who determines which of the 3 processes the patient has to go through, or can the patient choose?
Actually, that's an interesting one. I'll go back to that slide. That was this one. We have the 3 ways the patient could be treated. All are legal, all are covered by our health insurance. The patient actually cannot choose. Well, he could theoretically, but patients don't even know they could choose here. Patients just want an easy treatment and a good treatment for themselves. Actually, the hospital could direct that, because we could tell the patients we don't take their blood and they have to come with the results from a blood lab. And we could tell them we have no slots in computer tomography and they should go to an outside radiologist. We don't do that. I don't think many of the other hospitals would do that, because we don't think it's just morally, it's just not right, because it's not good for the client. But the possibility is there, the option is there. And what I know of departments who rather choose between the channels 2 and 3 here. And if a patient has an indication which gives you a good reason to keep him overnight, there are departments that try to keep people overnight, to maybe not necessarily would have to stay in a hospital.
Thank you, Helmut. Just to remind everyone that you can send your questions by typing them in the Q&A tab. I have here a question. What are key items that hospitals or health providers should keep in mind on how they can provide best possible medical services at optimum cost for healthy top and bottom line?
Just rereading that in the, you typed it here, fortunately, so I'm just rereading that. Should keep an eye on how they can provide best at optimum cost. Well, I think one key of that is to understand your processes and to start implement process costing, because it's very hard in a complex process when many departments and many people are involved within an organization to understand where the cost of a process occurs and where the value of a process occurs. It's really hard to understand for people why a day in a ward costs such an amount of money. It's very hard for people, for clinical people, to understand all the implications of the cost of a surgery. It's very difficult to understand why sending someone to an MR, magnetic resonance therapy, that the MR is not just here anyway and you just do an MR, but there is process cost involved. It's very difficult to say just do a blood lab, do a big blood lab, that the laboratory is anyway there, staff is anyway there, it's all fixed costs, so there's no additional cost. It's very hard to get it in the minds of people that every process consumes resources, and consuming resources means it costs money. That is a cultural thing just to avoid waste. Don't do unnecessary things. And when you do things, think about where's the benefit for the patient. And when there's a benefit for the patient, do it as efficiently as you can do it. And it's really mostly a cultural thing. And it's not a thing of implementing a heavy costing tool or implementing new features. It's really working on the culture.
Thank you, Helmut. You mentioned, culture, and also before about the importance of changing the culture. So we all know that this is very challenging. So do you have recommendations based on your experience on how to more efficiently and successfully do this within an organization?
So we use lean management initiatives strongly for that. You can't just walk around and say you have to do that or you have to talk about it. You have to involve people on every level of the organization, actually, strongly. And involving people means performing projects. Now, people are tired of projects because they have so much work day to day, and they don't want to do projects. But what we found out is we try to release part of their daytime work to participate on projects, small things, courses, a lean project here, a small cultural project there, to bring people together, to bring external consultants in to promote that way of thinking. We introduced huddle boards in our lean initiatives now in most of the wards and in most of the medical departments, which also have the function to just bring people together for 10, 15 minutes a day and work on improvements. And what it starts is that people talk about it. They don't need external people. They start talking to each other about issues they have. They feel accountable. They feel that they can change their own way of working, and the important thing is that you find quick wins where they see that those changes improve their position, their work, and improve the patient's outcomes. It's hard to say that in theory, but it's really a huge number of small steps. It's a huge management initiative, and it consumes lots of management time, but it has to come really down to the lowest level in the organization, to each one working on the patient.
Thank you. And in your experience, how many years did it take for your hospital to go through, the cultural change?
That's a good one. I'm with the hospital. Next week, I'm 4 years with the hospital. There were no initiatives before I came. We started about half a year after I came, and I would say we are about halfway. So the answer is 6 to 8 years till you are there, hopefully. But also then it's not done and you stop it. It's something you have to put energy in all the time. You have to put energy in. Once it's implemented in the whole organization, you have to keep it going. And that's one thing in the organization. But the real tough thing is to get it in the system, in our social security systems, you can do the best things if you're not rewarded by it, by health insurance, by the payers. It may have even negative outcome if you do the right thing, but the system doesn't change. So we invest also a lot of time. We spend with decision makers, policy makers, other institutions. We have cooperation groups with other hospitals to promote the idea of changing the payment of, for example, one big initiative is now in Austria is now that we try to have the same payment no matter what the point of service is. That's currently one of the big things, and we try to promote that it's really impossible where you do a service, but it's important which service is performed and that it's getting paid in the same way whoever does it. And the second big initiative with the policymakers is that they don't pay by activity and the amount of activities, but by the outcome. But that's a long shot.
Yeah. It's great though that you're getting, a lot of support from other hospitals and also policymakers and stakeholders. So in relation to that, what were the main challenges you have encountered in getting their support, and how did you overcome them?
That's a good question, because many of those we did not overcome yet, and I'm looking for advice how to overcome that. If someone has experience there, that would be great. Again, we try to do a lot of lobbying in the positive sense, a lot of conversations, a lot of talking to decision makers. Austria is a relatively slow-moving, let's say, conservative country in that way, and we are looking forward to other countries. We are looking at other countries who are much further than we are. For example, Denmark is for us is a good example. Or I don't know if Els is on the call still. Hi, Els. I think the Netherlands are a country which is on a fast pace forward, and so we try to come with good showcases from other countries and convince our politicians that these are sensible and good ideas.
All right, thank you, Helmut. Okay, so thank you, everyone. If you think of any additional questions later on, you can contact Helmut through the details displayed on your screen. Helmut, is there anything else you want to say before we end our webinar?
No, thanks for everyone who stayed till the end, and I wish you a good night, good morning, good midday, or wherever you are, in whichever time zone you are. And happy to talk to you, maybe in Muscat at the IHF Congress. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you very much, Helmut, for doing this webinar with us. It was a very interesting presentation. And we'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. We also hope you can join us again in our future webinars. Next month, we have a webinar with the Cancer Center Henri Becquerel in France. They will be talking about the new relational model that regards their patients as their partners. We'll send more information about that shortly. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you again, Helmut. I hope you all have a great morning, afternoon, or evening ahead of you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.